but the essence remains the same. So Pascal, in his inner um, consciousness, was a mystic. So there's some also a bridge can be made between Socrates with his demon and Pascal with his mystical attitude towards life. So this also should be taken into consideration. So what are those motives that sort of help scientists or to work in his field, to persevere, not to lose hope? So we'll see later how Einstein, where Einstein sort of found sources of inspiration. So this theme of inspiration, why persevere, why not get disillusioned, where to sort of find enough force to continue with your research. So this is also interesting, this a problem of motivation. Okay, now next slide, please, Marina. Okay, here's Spinoza, and well, this famous um, uh, place where he says that I will show that there are prejudices about good and bad, right and wrong, praise and blame, order and confusion, beauty and ugliness, and the like. So that people do not understand that uh, you see they think that God himself directs all things to a definite goal, and God made all things for man. And from this supposition, which Spinoza thinks it's a wrong proposition, that from this opinion, uh, so he will prove its falsity, and he will show that this opinion that God made all things for man, this from this opinion there come the prejudices about good and bad, right and wrong. So this is like Spinoza wants to say that we shouldn't regard nature anthropomorphically, shouldn't regard that in nature there are some purposes, and that God himself, who, the creator of nature, directs all things to a definite goal. So this will be important, because now, after I will end this just survey of the previous lectures, we'll speak about Leibniz and Voltaire and their famous discussion. Well, I mean, it was not a discussion between Leibniz and Voltaire, but Voltaire sort of is not in full agreement with the Leibniz idea of a God who arranges everything um, for a certain goal, so that the world would be optimal. So here is the contradiction between Spinoza and Leibniz. I remind you that Leibniz visited Spinoza, I think, in the year before Spinoza died. It was in 1676. So Leibniz was a young man. Spinoza was not well, not very young, and he was just going. He will die next year, so he was sort of somehow making some conclusions out of his philosophy, if he had some feeling that he will soon leave this earth. So this is very important, this disputation, or this disagreement between two important philosophers, Spinoza and Leibniz. And we'll see what new note Voltaire has introduced into this discussion. Please, next slide, Marina. This is Galileo. Well, this is not exactly the first edition. This is the edition which was published in London of Siderius Nuncius in 1653, but there were other editions. The first edition was published in Venice, and the second in 1610, and the second edition was published the same year in Frankfurt. So there are two editions which were published in the same year, 1610. And here is the London edition. You may wonder why in London this book was published in Latin and not in English translation. Well, at that time, educated people in London, in England, knew Latin very well. And you perhaps remember that the first edition of Newton's work, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, was also published in Latin a little bit later, not in 1653, but in 1687. And next slide, please, Marina. This is a famous dialogue of Galileo published to the left. We see the first edition published in Italy, and in Florence it's written, or in Florence, in 1632. This was this edition which was banned by the church later, and because of what Galileo was summoned to Rome and had many spent many unpleasant moments being interrogated by the Roman Inquisition. So this is this, and to the right we have a Latin translation of the same dialogue, which was published, as you can see, in Lugduni, or in Lyon in France, in 1641, the same year in which Descartes published his Meditations. So you can see that Galileo was still living. So, but the important thing is that this the Italian variant was banned by the church, but the Latin variant of the same book was published in Catholic France. At that time, there was the King Louis the 13th. Well, you remember perhaps if you have read the book of Alexandre Dumas, The Three Musketeers. So this is more or less the same epoch, okay? Well, now these are all, I think, yes? This is also another important slide. This is Francesco Maria Grimaldi, an Italian physicist who discovered the phenomenon of diffraction. So this book was published after his death in Bologna in 1665. And this book influenced Newton. So Newton, when he wrote his Optics, he borrowed some experiments from this book and mentioned the author, Grimaldi. But Newton gave another explanation of this phenomenon of diffraction, because Newton was well, adhered to corpuscular theory of light, not he didn't recognize wave theory. So well, that discussion will later meet when Max Planck will introduce his own idea of the quanta of light. So we can say that Newton was not quite wrong in his corpuscular theory of light. Grimaldi, well, he regarded light not as a wave, but as some fluid. Okay, so this well, this is enough just to, maybe they're all there are all slides, Marina, or there's some other?
Yes, that's all.
That's all. Yes, just excuse me for this brief survey of the materials which were discussed at length in our fourth and fifth lecture, and now we can start the new lecture, which will be devoted to the 18th century, and we'll start this lecture from this famous disputation about the world, whether the world is the best of all possible worlds, and whether there's some inner goal in all, or purpose in all the events that happen in this world, whether there is some preordination or some like design here, and so we can introduce the idea of purpose, or whether the world is just developing without any purpose, and then it will be perhaps a difficulty to understand how the purpose appears with man if it is absent in the universe as such. Okay, so just a moment. So you see, this is a very important discussion. So the first, um, the first like actor in this discussion is Leibniz, uh, a German physicist. I remind you, he was born in 1646 and died in 1716. So he belongs to the two centuries. Well, he started his life with a visit. He was born in Hanover. At that time, it was an independent little kingdom in on the territory of the present West Germany, Hanover, and it is famous for the fact that the king of Hanover was uh, invited to England to become an English king, George the First. Well, maybe some people like these dynasties and the names of the kings, and well, I know that some have this like hobby of studying royal biographies. So this George the First, who was from Hanover, he became the founder of this new Hanover dynasty, which still rules England. So Elizabeth II is a distant relative of this George the First, and has some German blood in her. Okay, so this made, of course, perhaps life for Leibniz better, because now he was the subordinate or the citizen of now a powerful king, who well. But the relations between Leibniz and the king were not very happy, because the king, George the First, being proud of becoming a king of England, asked Leibniz to write the history of the Hanover dynasty, starting from the first centuries well, from the period when Germany received Christianity, so from the first centuries of the first millennium till the George the First himself. Well, and Leibniz didn't like this idea, because he was engrossed in his own research. So he tried to procrastinate somehow, and procrastinated better, and prepared only the first volume of this history. So George the First was not satisfied with the tempo of the work, and asked Leibniz to work harder. So you understand that this is always the problem. For example, your scientific advisor can also ask you to work on your thesis and not just uh, and not give too much time and energy to philosophy. Okay, so I'm writing to only to Marina. I want to write to everybody, Leibniz, and so I will write to all. Okay, so so here we are. So Leibniz and George the First. So this always this confrontation of a scientist and of a political power. Okay, so well, the same perhaps will happen in the Soviet Union also, when those in power like Stalin and Beria would ask all the scientists to prepare new weapons, say nuclear weapons, and but the interests of prominent physicists were not in preparing nuclear weapons, but in studying theoretical physics. So you see, you should always understand that that there are interests of a scientist himself and interests of a political body or of the society. Okay, there was some problem, and Leibniz somehow managed somehow to pacify the king, and he published, parallel to his research on the history of Hanover dynasty, he published in 1610 a work which was called Theodicy. He published it in French, not in English and not in Latin. I give you an English translation of this work. So perhaps this word theodicy may seem strange to some of you. I will explain. This word was coined by Leibniz himself. This word didn't exist before Leibniz, so he invented this word, like Democritus invented the word atom. So what does it mean? It is formed out of two Greek words, theos and dikaios. Theos means God and dikaios means just. So it's about the justice of God, that God is just. Well, why should Leibniz devote attention to proving that God is just? That's because more and more people started to doubt that God is just, because there was so many evil, so much evil in the world. So in the facing this evil, which is obvious, people started to put a question. Maybe God doesn't exist at all, or maybe if he exists, he is not just enough to man. So this is a problem of divine justice. Well, and how did Leibniz wanted to solve this problem? This by means of the independently developed by him calculus, because in calculus there is a such notion as maximum and minimum of the function. So if you just take a derivative of a function and equate it to zero, so then you will find where the function undergoes minimums or maximums. So what now Leibniz applied all this formalism, and it was a new one, because nobody before Leibniz, well, maybe only Newton, who independently developed the same ideas, could understand how to just calculate those minimums and maximums. So now Leibniz applied this new formalism to the design of God. So according to Leibniz, before God, there were a multitude of possible worlds. So there with all their parameters, okay? So there was a like variational principle. So you could vary this world, say creating this or that man, or sort of creating this or that situation. So God had many chances sort of to select the world out of many possibilities. So now the criterion of selection. So in these all possible worlds, God selects the best. Okay, so what we have is the best of of all possible worlds. So all other worlds would be worse. Okay, that should sort of be kind of a mm, solution or for uh, people, because well, you can always say things could have been much worse than they are, for example. Well, consolation, you understand. Well, of course, this idea of Leibniz was in direct opposition. Yes, did he define best and worst? Yes, we can say that best, it means optimal. Um, well, you have to, in order to define best, you should first of all define good. What is good? Yes, and this leads us to the question of Fedosiev. What is philosophy? So philosophy is search for truth or wisdom. Then we should define what is truth and what is wisdom. Now, if you say that God created the best of all possible worlds, we should define what is best, because best is a form of the adjective, superlative form of the adjective good. So we have to define what is good. So we return to these problems of metaphysics, truth and false, good and bad. Okay, so of course this will be challenged by, say, Hegel, who would say that you cannot speak about absolute good and absolute evil. They are all in incessant sort of connection with each other. Yes, I will speak to that, Sergey. So you see that, well, we can say that there is a multitude of possible worlds. Okay, so there are many of them. So they differ according to certain parameters. Well, for Leibniz, had chosen only one parameter, the amount of evil in the world. Okay, if you can calculate the amount of evil, say the mortality, for example, or the number of death of innocent children, or the number of earthquakes, well, you have you can use different parameters in order to specify what you mean by a best world. Well, of course, the worst world perhaps is the world in which no life can be born. So the worst world is, say, when would happen if the solar system would be placed in the center of our galaxy, where there's too much of radiation and light and heat, and where gravitation is like beyond all borders. Okay, so you can, or you can also place our solar system in the vicinity of the black hole, and then it will just be sort of swallowed by this black hole. So you can understand that scenarios can be different. Okay, so, well, of course, this depends on the definition of what is good and bad, because the ancient Greek poets wrote that the best for man is not to be born at all. Okay, so if we take this definition of the best, then perhaps to be born in the vicinity of the black hole and be swallowed by it immediately, this is the best solution. Okay, so you understand that. So this depends on how you define these words, and but the procedure is just normal. That you, if you have a parameter and you define it somehow, then you can vary it, and then you can choose among all these possible worlds the world which seems to you the best. Okay, then you will just order it to create, to be created, like you find a document and then you send a directive to print it. Okay, so print it on paper. Okay, so before it existed only in your computer and you could somehow mend it or edit it, but then you say, well, it's optimal now. So I should either send it to somebody, for example, load it in the canvas. If you, so you will choose the optimal variant of your essay and load it on the canvas. Okay. But there, of course, the essay could be worse and better. It depends on how much time did you spend on, say, editing it, correcting it, just you understand. Well, this is creation. When you are creating something, you always seek to do the best thing, and then you will be called perfectionist. Um, how did he know? Well, just by introspection, because how do you know that your variant of the essay is worse than the variant that you loaded in on the canvas? Well, because you found some mistake, or say slip of the tongue, or of the pen. So you can can be many parameters according to which you can say that the work is not perfect. Okay, so Leibniz insisted on that idea that the work of God is perfect. Okay, so this optimal, and so this means that according to Leibniz, God was kind of an editor who sort of edited this design of the world that he wanted to create. Well, for Spinoza, it was absurd, because Spinoza did not recognize the creator that exists sort of on the outside or somewhere externally to its creation. For Spinoza, God and the world are the same. Okay, so and for Spinoza, always also what is important is that there is no other world. This world is one, and there can be no possible worlds. Otherwise, we could say that God is not omnipotent, God is not all powerful, because he created only one variant out of many. So you see, but Leibniz said, well, he's still like all powerful because he selected the optimal variant. So he didn't create just one variant out of many others. Then you could just say that he's not all powerful because these possibilities remain sort of unpublished. Okay, but you can say that they remained unpublished on purpose, because in those variants the evil was greater than in the variant that we have. Okay, so this was a compromise. So you understand that Leibniz spoke with Spinoza, perhaps read his works in either in manuscripts or in public, they were published posthumously, so he very well understood the logic of Spinoza, and was how to say, arguing with him and trying to find a solution. And because Spinoza was ignorant of calculus and didn't understand what is the optimization, so Leibniz used this, how to say, Leibniz considered that that was his chance to over argue Spinoza, because Spinoza was a poor mathematician and couldn't understand what is optimization. So Spinoza couldn't answer Leibniz because he was already dead in 1710 when this Theodicy appeared. So so there should have appeared another thinker who could answer Leibniz arguments. And this was not Spinoza, because Spinoza was not living at that time. He was already in his grave. But this was Voltaire. So Voltaire resumed this argument with Leibniz instead of Spinoza, and produced uh, his own sort of counter arguments against this thesis that our world is the best of all possible worlds. Um, yes, and this, Anastasia, can answer your question. So it will be answered by Voltaire, maybe more eloquently than by me, okay? We just, after a short break, will see how Voltaire will give his answer to Leibniz, and perhaps you will recognize your sort of ideas, because Voltaire, I think, will somehow share them, or there's some connection between your arguments, I mean, arguments of Anastasia and arguments of Voltaire. So, of course, this discussion is, well, I think it is central to a certain extent to, because it will prepare us to the discussion between Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein about the necessity or chance. Because if there's chance in this world, so we can say that there always there, this helps us to sort of embrace the concept of multi universes, or multi worlds, of many worlds, because if in quantum mechanics it's very easy. With Einstein, it was not so easy, because Einstein insisted that this world is one, it is fully deterministic, and it resembles the world of Spinoza. And Einstein embraced also the philosophy of Spinoza, and even when Spinoza was published in English, the editors asked Einstein to give his preface or introduction to the editions of Spinoza, and Einstein very eagerly did that. So he always insisted in the interviews or elsewhere that Spinoza was his favorite philosopher. So that's why this discussion between Leibniz and Spinoza is interesting. And now it is interesting to know also the arguments which Voltaire produced against this thesis of Leibniz, that our world is the best of all possible worlds, which we'll do, I think, in 5 minutes, okay? Very good. I have 5. Marina, do we have a presentation with Leibniz, Voltaire, and other slides?
I have Leibniz, but I don't have Voltaire.
Well, just show us
fine.
Leibniz, yes, or whatever you have for this lecture, so that we can have well, this is theodicy. You see, this is and also here in the central page, you see this famous question that Leibniz put, and it remains one of the central questions of, say, philosophy and philosophy of science. This question is formulated in French in this way: Pourquoi il y a plutôt quelque chose que rien? But in English, it is why there is something rather than nothing. Okay, so here is this question, which the question of so-called contingency. So, well, we just before we analyze this world or ourselves, we should put this question: why why this world exists when he could have not existed at all, and why I exist because I also couldn't have existed if, say, my parents decided not to have children, for example. So first of all, there should be this wonder about the existence, and also this attempt to find a certain like mm, foundation of what is the foundation of existence. So what, from what source does the existence come? This is the this work which is called Principles of Nature and Grace. This was also one of the works by Leibniz. You see, Leibniz preferred to express himself in French, although he was German, because he thought that at that time the initiative went to France, and that French language will be the language of future science, or future language of the scientists, of the learned. But maybe he was mistaken. Now we have English language, not French. And on the to the right, you will see the edition, not the first one, but you can see that's edition of Theodicy in French. So, well, maybe it's interesting that it was published in the same year in which Voltaire later published his famous Candide, or Optimism, which was a critic of Leibniz, uh, which contained criticism of Leibniz thesis. Now, do we have, Marina, another slide? Uh, no, this will be later. Uh, yes, okay. Uh, Maybe we'll speak about, we'll return to later, maybe to Newton and his, how to say, and Newtonian idea of the world, and we'll speak a little bit about Boscovich and his atomism, but maybe it will be in the second half of this lecture. Now I would like to finish with Leibniz and Voltaire. So we have to introduce another figure, which maybe more closely relates to philosophy of science than to science itself. This is Francois Marie Voltaire. Well, Voltaire is a pseudonym. Well, but well, by this pseudonym he is mostly known. Francois Marie is his like his name. So if you want to just, well, of course you can just speak to him as address him as a citizen Voltaire or Mr. Voltaire, but also you can, if you are in informal relations with him, you can say Francois Marie or Francois, just is his just Christian name. Well, he was born in France and was received also at the education in a Jesuit college like René Descartes. But well, if René Descartes remained a Catholic throughout his life, Voltaire was very skeptical about uh, the Catholic religion and didn't practice it. He had his own variant of religion. He believed in God as the architect of the universe, and but I think he more or less shared the opinion of Epicurus that after creating this world, God sort of left man to himself. So according to Voltaire, the main task of man is to work in this sort of created by world created by God and perfect it himself. Okay. Well, nevertheless, Voltaire underwent certain changes in his, I would say, um, in his philosophy, in his philosophical outlook, And the event that changed Voltaire's attitude, made him more pessimistic, was the earthquake which happened in Lisbon on the 1st of November 1755. Lisbon earthquake. Maybe now for many of you it is an event which is completely forgotten, because we have other examples of natural disasters, and perhaps these disasters of the old sort of um are obliterated from our memory. But for Voltaire, who was born in 1694 and died in 1778, this was an event which happened in his lifetime. And because of the enormous casualties which this Lisbon earthquake has sort of created, there was a shock throughout all educated Europe, because there were at that time there were newspapers already, and so everybody got to knew about this more or less in a few days. So this terrible news spread throughout Europe, and even young Goethe, who was born in Goethe, the famous uh, German poet, Goethe, we'll speak about him perhaps later, who was born in 1748 and was only 7 years when this Lisbon earthquake happened, remembers, and he writes about that in his reminiscences on the poetry and truth, that the grown-ups, his parents and all, uh, well, were very much shocked by the news of this earthquake and discussed it in, well, so it was largely discussed. Well, of course, Goethe was only 7 years old, so he couldn't just estimate the like the scale of the disaster, and couldn't just imagine what really happened, because children, they understand world from their childish point of view. But still, this produced some impression on Goethe, and he remembers it later when he remembered it later when he wrote his reminiscences. So for Voltaire, who was much older than Goethe, because at that time, because he was already in his 60s, so he was 61. Um, well, I'm 63, so you can understand how Voltaire looked when he was 61, and how perhaps he appreciated the world. So he was a grown-up person with his firm convictions, but he was optimist before this earthquake. He believed in human reason, in human abilities to change the world, and even believed somehow to Leibniz that this architect of the universe, this God of Voltaire, created perhaps the best possible world, and now our task is to make it still better. Okay, well, it is the best, I mean the best initial conditions, but we can add with our labor, with our political activity, we can add something to its amelioration. Okay, that's the idea of Voltaire, and Voltaire was optimistic. Well, at that time already in France there was started an ambitious project of encyclopedia of arts and technology, of science, arts, and of sciences, arts, and technology. So it was published in French also. So it seemed that Leibniz was right and the French language will be the language of the educated people throughout the world. And well, um, and it seemed so that, for example, later we'll speak that Immanuel Kant and David Hume, Immanuel Kant a German, David Hume an Englishman, they both were very fluent in French. So it seemed that all educated people more or less were fluent in French, including our Empress Catherine II. So you see, well, just it was a like a digression, but I want to say that Voltaire was optimistic and perhaps shared the ideas of Leibniz about the perfect architect of the world. But after this earthquake, he seemed to doubt this goodness or justice of God. And so he wrote first a poem about the Lisbon earthquake, where his doubts and his feelings were expressed in this poetical form. But then he decided that it's not enough, and he wrote a work in prose, which is much more remembered, which is called Candide uh, or Optimism. So so this work deserves to be mentioned and discussed because it's philosophical. So here we deal with this question which Anastasia Smirnova put to me. Uh, were the existence of diseases and wars the most optimal alternatives according to Leibniz? Uh, so, I would say if Anastasia have read Candide or this, well, I put Candide the stress on the second syllable because it was written in French. Uh, but we can say also Candide. Well, this is the name of a main hero of this novel. This comes from Latin word adjective candidus, uh, which can be uh, translated as white, also open, like candid. You know the adjective candid in English. Well, we say candid. It means open. Uh, uh, how to say honest also. Well, there are many just ways to express this adjective candid. So, we can say also that this has a connotation of innocence also in Latin and maybe in French. So this candid was an innocent, um, honest, uh, good young man, full of optimism, and he was brought up in a certain aristocratic family, although he was like a, uh, I would say, uh, he was an orphan, so he was taking out of charity to by these aristocrats to their castle, but he was given a good education together with the daughter of those um, owners of the castle, whose name was Kunigunda. Kunigund. Well, Kunigund is not Kunigund is not a name which you can find easily among your friends or acquaintances. Now it is a little bit obsolete, and I think people do not call their children Kunigund. Well, but it was a medieval saint woman, and so maybe in the 18th century, German aristocrats could still call their children, their daughters, by this name. Maybe it was with a touch of irony that Voltaire just um, invented such a curious name for main heroine. So, and of course, because they were children that were brought up together, so it's natural that they got in love with each other, Candide and Kunigund. So this love story is a main like motive that will pass through the whole novel. Um, uh, but what happened? First, they received the a good education by the direction of a certain philosopher and teacher philosopher who was called Pangloss. Well, Pangloss is also a name with many meanings. Glossa means also in Greek it means language, and it also means commentary. So Pangloss can be a man who knows all languages, all the commentaries. So he's like a paradigm of educated man, but somehow absorbed in his theoretical work and far from sort of crude reality, we can say. So Pangloss was hired by these aristocrats, Prussian aristocrats, to give the best possible education to their child Kunigund, and by also by the way, to Candide, because Candide was also brought up in this family out of charity. But when so the main idea of Pangloss was the idea of Leibniz, that this world is the best of all possible worlds, and that all tends to the best outcome in this best of the possible worlds. So you should be optimistic. You should believe in providence, that everything that happens with you tends to some very fine goal, and that even some disasters that can seem to be evil, they also have some secret purpose which also tends to good, and somehow good will be brought even out of evil. Okay, so for a child in a very prosperous family, aristocratic family, it's these ideas of this education seems quite plausible, and because they don't seek like real life. As one of you in your essays wrote me, they didn't leave the comfort zone. Okay, so they were brought up in the comfort zone. But then, what happened? I explained to you that they fell in love with each other, Kunigund and Candide. So when the parents detected that, they were not happy with this orphan of so low descent marrying their uh, only daughter, okay, unique daughter. So they just showed him, they just, how to say, banished him from this castle, okay? And he, had to face the world as it is. So he was, like we can say again, banished out of this zone. He left this zone, comfort zone, okay? And he uh, just sort of uh, was put in thrown into the big world, okay, without any connections, without any friends, without any money. So at that time the war has started. So this was the famous 7 Years War, which still was raging when Voltaire wrote this novel. It was how to say, yes, raging, we can say, from 1755 to 1762. This is a 7 years war. So this is perhaps the most, um, how to say, uh, strange war in the history of Europe, because nobody can understand why did it start, and what were its causes, and what were the effects of this war. So it seemed that nothing really changed in Europe after this 7 years war. If you may be an expert of history, then you can say, well, um, uh, remember, for example, how Russian troops entered Berlin in 1761, because Russia also took part in this 7 years war. Well, for Russians, it's perhaps a point of honor uh, that our troops entered Berlin, or before that Königsberg also, so were victorious over Prussia. And Friedrich II, who was at that time the emperor of Prussia, or the king of Prussia, was somehow at the at the edge of just total catastrophe. But then Elizabeth Petrovna, who was the empress of Russia, died, and when her nephew Peter III became the king for a short time in 1762, he ended this war and returned to Friedrich II all the territories that were won or captured by Russians. So that's how this strange war ended. Also, just very how to say, in an unexpected way. But for Voltaire, it was just a insanity, a fit of insanity that seized Europe. This war out of nothing and for nothing. Okay, so he, of course, he described it in this work Candide in a very, I would say, ironical and even sarcastic tones. But what happened? Because this war raged at that time, so Candide had a chance to enter as a mercenary in the army. So he was a hired soldier, okay? And that saved his life, but of course it showed him all the negative things that happen in the world, because he saw all the horrors of war. And while facing with another example of this horror, he remembered with perhaps some irony the words of Pangloss, his teacher, that always tends to the best in this best of all possible worlds. Well, somehow the vicissitudes of the war led him to Lisbon. And what happened in Lisbon? In Lisbon, he met Kunigund, who and he met her in um, uh, say in a public house, in a bordel, we can say, a brothel, we can say, where he, well, why this daughter of aristocrats found herself in a brothel? What has happened? Why she had to sell herself to clients, okay, as a prostitute? Because this also because of the war, because their castle was demolished, and she was violated by the troops, and so they lost all her money, and perhaps her parents were killed. I don't remember the exact details, but so she had to confine herself to the only way in which women not prepared to hard labor can get some living, just to become a victim of prostitution. Okay, so they met again in Lisbon. Well, it was a happy, they were still young and their love still persisted, so they could hope for a happy outcome. But at that time, this famous Lisbon earthquake just happened. And again, they uh, lost each other and were reunited only much later. just there was some trip to Latin America. Other maybe interesting, but I would say um, honors like information, which I will skip. So what this novel Candid ended, well, maybe more or less happily. They both became old. Kunigund, as Voltaire underlines, became not very beautiful, even ugly in her old age. So Candid didn't love her anymore, but he still insisted that they should live together just out of principle, because the brother of Kunigund still opposed the idea of their marriage, because he still considered that whatever happened with Kunigund, she's still an aristocrat by birth, and Candid is still a nobody. So out of the opposition to this brother, Candid decided to marry Kunigund, although he didn't love her anymore and she was ugly. So somehow they married and had a plot, how to say, well, a little, well, we can say plot, I think. It's a little square of, or can say a little, um, um, well, well, plot is, can you, we use plot for a little piece of earth, okay? Plot. Is it okay, Javier? Well,
Yes,
just,
it is.
yes, then a little piece of earth, okay, where they built a house, and the novel ends with this like famous sentence, "Il faut cultiver notre jardin" in French, which is we should cultivate our garden, or we should just toil in our garden. So garden reminds us of the Garden of Eden or the paradise. So the task is, like Francis Bacon put it, cultural mandate. So to cultivate the earth. Well, by garden means this slow little part of this habitable earth that is at our disposal. We are somehow have obligations to toil sincerely here in this place. Well, we can say in this laboratory, or in this institute, or on this thesis. So we have some maybe modest task at our sort of committed to us by life or by circumstances. And what we can do is to make our work uh, honestly, correctly, and as perfect as we can. So this is this modest goal which we should put before ourselves, and do not think, or just do not leave all those metaphysical ideas about the best of all possible world, about the God's design. So there are two sort of, how to say, they are too high for man's intellect, and cannot be proved, because all the experience that candidate Kunigund had of this life was just opposite to what they were taught by their teacher in their young age. So, um, well, I would ask, cottage, a small piece of land, is not big enough to be a farm. Well, I forgot the French original. Well, I think it is a farm they had, because they sustained themselves from agricultural work. So they worked on, they toiled the land, the land produced some fruit or vegetables, so they sustained their living from the, like, fruits of their work. Okay, so they toiled the earth and just gathered the fruits which it produced. Okay, so they were like peasants. Okay, maybe they used also hired labor, I don't know, but well, that's the end of the novel, that they were not prosperous, they were no multimillionaires, but they were not beggars also. They had some modest just piece of land, a farm, some well, maybe some workers or, or servants. Was a view of religion. Uh, yes, to some extent, it was a rethinking of the Christian narrative if we take this idea of Adam and Eve in the paradise. So um, God sort of committed, or yes, well, committed to Adam the work of toiling and the garden of paradise. So it seems that Voltaire alludes to this like well, toiling in the garden. So but the idea is that God does not intervene. So God created this garden and put Adam and Eve in this garden and told them, just work in this garden uh, and also multiply yourself and um, beget children. So this is your task. I've done what I could. Now this is your turn to make the world better. Well, according to Leibniz, it seems that the position of a man is not a position of an active worker, but a position of a just observer. Well, you know that Leibniz was a theoretician and he belonged to this, we call it rationalist tradition. So he was a rationalist. And Francis Bacon belonged to the empirical tradition. So it seems that Voltaire also sort of embraces this Baconian approach, that we should not be only observers or theoreticians or meditate on the final truths as René Descartes or Leibniz or even Spinoza, but take an active stand, active position in this world and try to do something by our hands. Okay, this is maybe this is important for Skoltech, I think, because you are also trying to do something with your research, somehow to change the world, find, for example, effective drugs or effective batteries or just some ways to take the oil out of earth. Okay, so it depends on where, or maybe you make better the computers somehow. You are doing some practical work. That's the meaning of tech. In Skolkovo it's a village, but tech, it's of techne, which means in Greek art. So you are trying to just to invent something new and to make the world better. That's why I've chosen this novel of Voltaire. Now, just to finish with Voltaire and his views, well, I can cite his letter, private letter to Emperor Friedrich II. It was written in 1770. Well, in this letter is very pessimistic. Voltaire just recognizes that he doubts everything, that he doubts the existence of God, that he doubts the existence of future life, that he doubts that virtue is remunerated on this earth and that vice is punished. So and he doesn't understand whether, say, Sultan Mustafa is more happy in his garem or harem than a philosopher who has problems with digesting food. Okay, so, well, before, of course, Voltaire would think that philosopher is more noble than any sultan or any political leader, but now he even doubts this truth. So he's and you remember this, if we take the date of this letter, and I think it's a genial letter, not not forged. Uh, uh, well, we'll speak about Lamarck also, maybe a little bit later when we'll speak about Charles Darwin. It will be the science of the 19th century already. Maybe also because, well, for Lamarck, you know, this, if you work on yourself, you could, your progeny could inherit all those sort of habits that you formed during your life. Okay, so it's not in vain. Okay, so that you can uh, sort of mm, uh, well, this your new habits, or this your new features that you sort of created here by your toil, can be inherited, and in this way enrich the, how to say, um, the genes of future generations. Okay, well, of course, Lamarck didn't use the word gene, but he used the word heritage. Okay, so, well, we'll speak about that later. Maybe here we, well, whatever we can speak about Lamarck and his hypothesis of acquiring of inheritance of acquired habits, we can say that in technology, in the technological progress, of course, the Lamarckian view, it works, because your, say, inventions can be used by further generations. For example, Fleming discovered penicillin antibiotics, and now we can use and improve this, find new antibiotics, but we all, just all of us, sort of share this happy discovery of Fleming. So it well, it will, this idea leads not only to Lamarck's views, but better we can speak about Auguste Comte, um, another Frenchman, and his positivism. Well, but Auguste Comte is a figure of the 19th century, because he only was born in the 18th century, but he lived all his life, he passed in the 19th century. Um, so with Comte, these ideas of Lamarck were just generalized to all progress of humanity. And of course, it was in some continuation of Voltaire's thesis about cultivating the garden. Okay, it's just, well, that's well, I just wanted to end this discussion of Voltaire's doubts that he died perhaps a not very happy man, because when he was 76, when he wrote this letter to Friedrich II, 76 is the age when a person should be somehow um, returned to some equilibrium and to some peace of mind and body, I would say. But we cannot find these traces of this inner peace in this letter of Voltaire. So it seems that Voltaire was doomed to be um, sort of uh, doubting throughout all his life. Okay, but he was not an active, atheist, as he sometimes depicted. A doubting man never can be very active, because to be active, you should firmly believe in your premises. So from this letter of Voltaire, we can say that he didn't believe firmly in some idea, so that to sort of implement it. Well, also we can remember the the Testament of Voltaire. Here, according to one of the most accepted versions of the Testament of Voltaire, he writes these things: I die adoring God, loving my friends, forgiving my enemies, and despising superstition. Okay, so the only thing that remained throughout all Voltaire's life was that he fought with superstition. Well, how he imagined this superstition, whether it was Catholic religion in general, or Christianity, or Islam, or Judaism, we can it depends on what work of Voltaire should we take. Sometimes he was very, very sarcastic towards Christianity, also towards the Jews, for example, and even to the point of being an anti-Semite. Also, he was sarcastic about Muslim religion. So, well, that can be followed throughout the life of Voltaire, his fight with superstition, which is somehow connected with all organized religion to in more or less degree, because people are prone to superstition, and it's people who profess even very noble creeds like Christianity, for example, with its cult of, or Buddhism with its cult of nonviolence. But people insert in these religions all their sort of nature, like we can say fallen nature, using the Christian metaphor. So, well, Voltaire fought superstition throughout all his life. That can be like a sort of invariant of his life. And he was adoring Dieu, adoring God. He wrote "un adorant Dieu," so adoring God. Well, I couldn't say that he was like a prayerful man who was always on his knees adoring God, but well, he summed up his sort of attitude, which that he was grateful for God for creating this world, whatever it is, best or not best of all possible worlds. And loving his friends, yes, he was friendly and he had a lot of acquaintances and pen friends also. For example, our empress, Russian Empress Catherine the Great, Catherine II, was one of his closest pen friends, and there is a lot of letters that they exchange with each other. Also, he was a friend with encyclopedists who wrote this encyclopedia, D'Alembert, Diderot, and others. And also, well, about forgiving his enemies, well, I don't think so that well, he writes that he forgives his enemies, but he had, of course, a lot of enemies because of his very sharp tongue. Well, that's more or less the end of the story. So after the break, I think 10 minutes I need just to relax, and perhaps you are also tired of this discussion. So we'll speak about scientific views. This will again remember Newton and his predecessors, and we'll devote some time to Joseph Ruder Bošković and his atomistic concept, which was developed just in the middle of the 18th century, which I consider to be a very important step in the development of atomistic theory and generally the theory of matter. So now I ask for 10 minutes. Well, let's resume our work. And so we'll switch a little bit to another subject, but also somehow connected with Voltaire, because you know that if from the biography of Voltaire you can get that the information that as a young man he spent 3 years in England and also wrote there the foundations of the Newtonian philosophy or something like that. So he was very much impressed by Newton's work and his concept of the universe. So this Newton and Leibniz were two main sort of driving forces under Voltaire's sort of worldview. And also a friend of his, Marquise du Châtelet, she translated with the help of Voltaire the work of Newton, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, from from Latin into French. Okay, then I will ask Marina, if you are present here, can you show us Borelli, for example, the slide with Borelli? Because yes, because Borelli was mentioned by Newton in his polemics with Hooke. He said that Hooke was not modest, but Borelli did something. Well, here is Borelli did something and wrote modestly. You see, so how this, if you want to study sort of Newtonian, like how Newton developed his system, you should see how he regarded his predecessors. There were two of them, the most important. Both were Italians, Grimaldi in optics and Borelli in theory of motion, in mechanics. So, well, Borelli in his, please, Marina, return to the previous slide where, yes, in this book published in 1666, the theory of the Medicean planets, well, Borelli accurately tried to show how possible is the circular motion of the planets around a gravitating body. But of course, he was forbidden, although he praised Galileo in the introduction to this book, he was prohibited by the Inquisition to publish some Copernican ideas, because at that time Copernicus was, as you remember from what we spoke about Galileo's case, Copernicus and his work was put on the index, and Copernican heresy was still, how to say, prescribed by the church. So here, as you see, this book was published in Florence, in the same city in which Galileo published his dialogues on two world systems. So he had to be very accurate. But still, of course, Borelli secretly admired Galileo and his work, and that's why he wrote on the Medici planets, which are satellites of Jupiter. So now, because he selected this topic, the motion of satellites of Jupiter, he was free of accusations from the possible accusations from the Inquisition, because Inquisition didn't pronounce anything against a theory of satellites of Jupiter. More than that, satellites of Jupiter were widely used at that time by all people, and also Jesuit missionaries in China, for example, for sort of a certain for how to say, finding the longitude of the place. Okay, well, with latitude it's easier, so you just observe the sun in its peak in the noon, how high it sort of rises in the sky, and then you can have an idea what latitude is of the place where you are. But with longitude it's not so easy. So these eclipses of the satellites of Jupiter, which happen rather often, and they happen astronomically in the one, say moment of time. So they are seen in different places of the Earth at different times, depending on the longitude of the place. So there were so-called Cassini tablets, yes, um, tables, Cassini tables, which from which you could see if you observe the say the eclipse of a certain satellite of Jupiter in a certain say time according to your local situation. For example, a sunset or in the moon or in the noon according to your place. That's not in the noon, but in the midnight, according to your place, then, um, well, yes, the Earth and the Moon was not prohibited to discuss. You could discuss the Moon, and you remember that the Church agreed, and Bellarmine even agreed that perhaps the Moon is not doesn't consist out of ether. So this was not prohibited to sort of discuss these topics. But what was prohibited is to discuss the motion of the Earth around the Sun. So Borelli had to switch to the more modest topic of discussing the motion of the satellites of Jupiter. But of course, everybody understood that it was only due to the censorship, but he meant, of course, by explaining the motion of the satellites of Jupiter, he took the more profound topic of Copernican system, only that he was prohibited to mention it expressly. And his encomium to Galileo in the preface to this book, which was written in Latin, uh, can also sort of prove that secretly Alfonso Borelli admired Galileo and his work, but he couldn't just openly say that Copernicus was right. Otherwise, the book will not be published, and nobody will in Florence will dare to publish this book, and he will have some uh, unpleasant relation. His relations with the church will be spoiled. Okay, so he didn't want to spoil his relations with the church, and he didn't want to touch this sort of also touchy subject. Okay, if we can use this play of words. So that's why Borelli insisted on discussing the satellites of Jupiter. I mentioned to you, have mentioned to you that even Jesuits, well, the maybe the most um, faithful sons of the Catholic Church, while being missionaries in China, they used these tables of Cassini and the eclipses of satellites of Jupiter. So with satellites of Jupiter, there was no problem. The church recognized them and it was allowed to discuss their motions. So, but Borelli, uh, while discussing why the satellites of Jupiter move around Jupiter and what is the force which sort of allows them to move or sort of impels them to move and how this motion is possible, he comes to the ideas which closely resemble the ideas of Newton, the idea of the momentum and the conservation of the momentum, and the idea of a kind of a gravity, central gravity. So that's why Newton praised Borelli, that Borelli did something and did it modestly. Okay, so well, you see that the work of Borelli was published in 1666. It was published in Latin, so Newton, who knew Latin very well, could read it. And well, at that time, Newton was only 22 years old. Well, he himself later confessed that in that year, 1666, which was the idea of the plague in London, yes, plague, yes, uh, Florence. Yes, Florence was the city where the academy, the Platonic Academy, was formed anew in 1462. This I address you to the my lecture on Renaissance. So Florence was a republic where the or the city where the union of the churches took place. So many Greek intellectuals arrived to Florence with the precious manuscripts of Platonic and Neoplatonic works, the works of Platonists and Neoplatonists. And so, because of this Greek influence and Greek manuscripts and the uh, mm, mm, like cultural activity of the Duke of or the leader of Florence, Cosimo Medici, that made Florence the like the one of the most important cities, cultural places in Europe. Well, now it is maybe not so, and we will see how centers moved from Italy to England and Germany and France. So, but still, we should just be objective and understand that Borelli is an intermediate figure between Galileo and Newton. Okay, so and Newton himself mentions it. And so returning to the year 1666, well, am I pronouncing this word correctly? This plague, yes, plague, I think, yes, this a disease, yes. Javier, plague, yes. Thank you.
Plague,
Plague,
yes.
yes. So this was the year of the famous plague, which devastated London, and also the year of think of a great fire. Well, maybe I mix up these two disasters, but this was a year of great disasters for England. But Newton said that in this year of great disasters, he had his two most important insights. Well, usually it is described as if apple fell on the head of Newton while he was lying under the apple tree, but it's just a folklore. But Newton himself described this fateful year, he said, in which he had his most important, um, like, um, well, insights. First insight was in the nature of gravity, and the second insight was in the nature of light. Well, and we can say that this is very interesting that perhaps in this year he read two books which appeared, well, one book of Borelli and another book of Grimaldi, which I have shown you in the beginning of our lecture. Grimaldi wrote on optics, Borelli wrote on gravity. So these two books helped Newton to develop his own ideas in mechanics and in optics, which later appeared in two different works. A first work was Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which appeared in 1687. And then another book is about optics, which appeared, I think, in 1705 or something around that date. Optics of Newton. I don't remember the exact date, but so, well, usually because of the so-called economy of thinking, we attribute to Newton all the discoveries that happened in the 17th century. For example, we attribute to Newton this idea that motion of the planets is due to attraction from the sun and their conservation of the momentum. Well, so also angular momentum, like, well, in Russian we say момент количества движения. Well, this may be okay. Well, I think it's more or less angular momentum, or maybe I'm mistaken. But the idea is that while moving around the orbit, this angular momentum of the planet is conserved, and this is also the subject of the first law of Kepler, the law that maybe the second law of Kepler, that uh, well, because elliptical character of these orbits, which was first observed by Kepler, was explained by Borelli in this while he said that these ellipses and their characteristic depend on the velocity or impetus with which the planet starts its motion around the central object. At that time, well, for him it was Jupiter, but you can also always just change Jupiter for Sun, and everything will remain as it is. So the most important idea was this, that when the planet approaches, say, well, we can say the Sun, or if a satellite approaches Jupiter, it will move faster. If when it sort of is more distant from this center of its orbit, it moves slower. This is also um, the contents of one of the laws of Kepler. Okay, so this is what Borelli did, and what Newton later just put in a precise mathematical form. Well, Grimaldi did some experiments also with prisms, and he just placing the prism before a ray of a ray of the sun, or just a ray of light, he saw how prism sort of makes this, he saw what we call now dispersion of light. Okay, so Grimaldi all described all these experiments in his book on optics, which was published in Latin in 1665. I have shown you the title page of this work. So you see, 1665, the work of Grimaldi; 1666, the work of Borelli. And for young Newton to read both of these books was a great, reading of these two books led him to a great insight, great insights, both in theory of gravity and in optics. Well, I again return to this idea of economy of thinking, that we tend to to forget Borelli and Grimaldi and attribute everything to Newton. Only with Hooke, it was not so easy, because Hooke was a contemporary and also an Englishman, and worked also in London. So Hooke protested against attributing everything to Newton. And so Newton sarcastically said in response to Hooke that I was standing on a shoulders of giants, just alluding to the fact that Hooke was of very low height. Okay, so it was also sarcastic when he said that I was standing on the shoulders of giants, because Hooke was of very, I would say, less than medium height. Okay, so it was like a polemic. It should be, this phrase should be understood in the context of Newton's polemic with Hooke. So about Hooke we know something because of these polemics, and we cannot hide that. Also, we cannot hide the polemics between Leibniz and Newton about the who invented the calculus. Perhaps they invented it independently and at the same time. So both pretended that they were the inventors of higher mathematics or calculus. Okay, so but with optics and with theory of gravity, nobody except some scholars in history of science, nobody remembers these two Italians, Grimaldi and Barelli. So I think it would be good to inform you that here also we have the case of some people who influenced Newton. And he both remembers both of them in his works. And he cites the works of Grimaldi and the works of Barelli. Okay, so now we have just finished the problem of Newton and his originality, and we are now going to the deficiencies of the concept of Newton. So the deficiency was that Newton couldn't explain the so-called adhesion or the forces of attraction, which are easily observed and well, their cause remained sort of unexplained in Newtonian world. So what to do with these forces? So Newton, you remember that he said, I don't invent hypotheses. So he didn't want to just invent some hypothesis which would just explain this force, which we call this hypothesis ad hoc. Means in Latin, it means for this case. So we observe adhesion, we want to explain it, and so we introduce the forces of attraction. But we don't know what are these forces of attraction, where do they come from, how mathematically to describe them in a certain formalism. So Newton said that he doesn't want to dabble or to enter, to introduce this hypothesis, to invent them. Well, this is in Latin, he wrote hypothesis non fingo. Well, just hypothesis is in plural, non fingo. This is in Latin, how he expressed his thought. Fingere, it means to invent in Latin. So I don't invent hypotheses. That's why the world remained to some extent unexplained. So it was the task of another prominent physicist who remains a little bit in shadow. But of course, if you want to Google him, you will find this surname, Boscovich. He was a Jesuit and a Catholic from Croatia. I tried to understand his biography, and I went upon the circumstance that his father was a Serb and his mother was an Italian. So it was not just, but you know, Croatians and Serbs are divided only by religion. Croatians are Catholics, Serbs are Orthodox. So because Boscovich was baptized in the Catholic Church and received Catholic education and became a Jesuit, so how to say, a priest, so that made him Croat, okay? But Serbs also venerate him and as their compatriot, so Boscovich. So he was born in 1711 and died in 1787. Well, more or less the dates of Voltaire, plus minus, or the dates of he was born in the same year as David Hume, a famous English philosopher, Scottish philosopher, if you want. So Boscovich wrote a book. Well, he was quite a young man. It was in 1758. He wrote a book about a Newtonian picture of the world. And also in this book, he introduced an original atomistic hypothesis. So atomism was like in a certain decay because Descartes didn't want to embrace atomism, and also Newton was reluctant to embrace atomism openly. But still, well, for Boscovich made a certain innovations in atomistic hypothesis. First of all, he did away with shapes of atoms because this concept of shape, and it was not so easy to understand how from shape come qualities. Okay, so how qualities are connected with shape. Well, you remember with Plato the same, the tetrahedron was the how to say, the element of fire, and because of this angle at, at the vertex of the tetrahedron, so the air, or I'm sorry, fire can injure us, or so we have this sensation of heat. Well, it's looks very, very naive. Okay, so for Boscovich now the problem of shapes of the atoms, I'm sorry, I have to, okay, so this my batteries shows that I the charge of my battery is very low, so I've just put it uh, um, okay, this is my absent-mindedness. Excuse me. So now let's continue with Boscovich. So he did away with the shapes of the atoms. According to Boscovich, atoms were regarded as points, shapeless points of and centers of forces of attraction and repulsion. Okay, so all the properties are explained by forces. So if you want to sort of, if you try to move one atom to another, they cannot coincide, because when you move them, try to move them together, there will appear a very high force of repulsion. So this repulsive potential, we can see, does not allow the points to merge with each other. But then if you uh, enlarge this distance between the atoms, this force of repulsion is changed into the force of attraction. And so it happens several times. So dependently on the distance between the atoms, this force alternates from repulsion to attraction and vice versa. And at the end, when the distances grow large compared with the distances that exist in the solar system, or distance between Earth and the Sun, this force approximates the law of gravity, or the force of gravity introduced by Newton. Okay, so the force of gravity is only an approximation for these forces for large distances. And also, what is interesting, Boscovich introduced the last change. So on very great distances, compared with the distances between galaxies, or as we can now say, this force of attraction, this force of, yes, this force of attraction, gravitational attraction, also changes to kind of repulsion, because in order to conserve, in order to withstand the melting of this finite universe in one body, so somehow some force should act in order not to let all the planets, all the stars to sort of be attracted to each other by the force of gravity and to approach each other, and in the course of time just to like uh, mm, uh, form sort of one mass. Okay, so you understand that is the problem for if we take a finite universe with Newtonian forces of attraction. So this finite number of stars will just tend to sort of attract to each other, and so they eventually, during the very large periods of time, they can sort of melt together. Okay, so in order to prevent this outcome, Boscovich makes a hypothesis that this law of gravity again changes at very high distances, and this force of gravitational attraction is changed to a force of repulsion. Well, of course, it's very, very abstract, but it of course couldn't be confirmed by some experiments, but it could explain. The explanatory force of this Boscovich hypothesis is great, because for the first time it was possible to explain the stability of atoms in crystals, for example. Because if we take this curve of forces or potential, so we see when this curve like crosses the x-axis, so there are two variants, variant of instability and variant of stability. So variant of stability is when with if we make the distance larger, then there appears a force of attraction, which sort of and when the distance is a little bit less, then appears a force of repulsion. So here, these forces of attraction and repulsions make this equilibrium stable. So this is an idea of a stable equilibrium. And so these forces sort of regulate this stability, okay? So, so these atoms are in their positions, and this law of changing of forces of attraction and repulsions make their position stable. So this stability, you remember that this stability of the world was a challenge to Epicurean and Democritean atomisms. Now this problem is solved. And also, so now we can understand what holds together atoms in bodies. Okay, so atomism becomes now a valid, intellectually respectable hypothesis. And so in this way, it was later assumed by chemists such as Dalton, Mendeleev, and others, and later by Boltzmann in his kinetic theory of gases. So this, well, we can say who knows Boscovich now? Only historians of science. Well, perhaps now, yes, but in the 19th century, he was very well remembered by many important physicists, such as Faraday and Maxwell. This is interesting because Faraday also introduced this idea of a force field or field of forces, okay? And Maxwell also was continuing these ideas of Michael Faraday, and they both appreciated Boscovich very high. Also, some words of praise to Boscovich we can find even in such philosophers as Friedrich Nietzsche. So in the 19th century, people still remembered him. In the 20th century, perhaps he's less remembered. But now, due to the work of the historians of science, this name falls from this name just appears from its oblivion, and we can see, like in Boscovich, this missing link, you understand, missing link between Faraday, Maxwell, and Newton. Okay. Coulomb, yes. Coulomb lived much later than Newton, than Boscovich. You can see the dates. Bill, to please find Google the dates of birth and death of Coulomb. Coulomb, and because you will see that Boscovich was appeared with his hypothesis earlier. Well, now, well, I think that it's time just to finish with physics and again return to philosophy. Well, in physics, I always feel, yes, thank you, Dmitry Kryukov. So, so Coulomb was only 22 years old when Boscovich already published his work. So it makes us doubt that Coulomb influenced Boscovich, but it is possible that Coulomb was influenced by Boscovich. But Coulomb was not, perhaps Coulomb didn't need Boscovich because he was an experimentalist. So he just made experiments with charges and experimentally found his law. So maybe this, Boscovich was a last perhaps representative of this rationalist tradition, which started with Descartes, so and was continued by Leibniz. Now, maybe just this is not a final solution. You understand? This is only for your private, like ignition for your private meditations on this subject. So if you are evolutionists, and I think most of you are, then you should understand that the progress of science is also evolutionary. So you can find, you should find these missing links, these intermediate forms, and don't be afraid to introduce new names like Borelli, Grimaldi, and Boscovich. They are precious for a scientist who takes the evolutionary approach and is seeking for some extinct species which were like bridges between existing species. Okay, so here there's nothing that is sort of not valuable or not important. And the less known is the name, if we can prove that this scientist or his discoveries or his books were influential in a certain way for the development of science in general, then the more interest it should arouse in us. We should not economize on thinking and think, for example, that insects produced apes and apes produced men. We should just enter in details. So what insects and what happened after, what were mammals, for example, and so on. So we should we should enter into details also when we deal with the history of science. So don't be scandalized when I introduce new names. Now we'll change completely the subject. I well, I can make a 5 minutes break, but Marina, is it necessary, or are you tired, for example?
I'm not tired.
You are not tired. Then please show us, say, something that is connected with Immanuel Kant. Do we have some, or maybe a book of Boscovich also, some of the slides? We have, I think we have this book of Boscovich, yes? Yes, here is a, a, an edition which was published in Venice in 1758, and here's the translation into English, which was published in 1912. I don't see this. Well, but it's the beginning of the 20th century. So, you know, somebody did this translation. So, seems that it was important for the Englishman to have this work translated into English. And now, because if you master English, so you can read it in English. You don't need the knowledge of Latin. Okay. Well, then we have something, Marina. We have something about Kant, I think, also. Yes. Yes, Hegel on. Let's think on. Well, with Hegel, we'll speak. No. Let's return to Hegel. It's good. Um, mm, Marina, let's return to Hegel. Yes. Just well, with Hegel, we'll deal, I think, at length in our next classes, which will take place, I hope, on Thursday, because Hegel belongs to the 19th century, and we are still in the 18th century. But Immanuel Kant, he belongs to the 18th century, and especially his most known book, the Critic of Pure Reason. And here in that book, what is interesting for us as a philosopher, from the point of view of the philosophy of science, are so-called antinomies, antinomies of Kant. So antinomy is can be translated from how explained, translated from the Greek, I think, because this antinomy was kind of also, maybe in this way, it was also coined by Kant, like theodicy was coined by Leibniz, so antinomy was coined by Kant. It, well, maybe this word existed in Greek, but in quite other sense. So anti is against. Nomos is law. So this is something that against the law. The law, what law? The law of thinking. So the law of logic. So if something defies or challenges the laws of logic, it should be called antinomy. So antinomy is here in Kant's sense is our inability to choose between two opposite conclusions or two opposite theses. And there are four such examples of the inability of our reason to choose between two alternatives in very important subjects. So this is the foundation of this criticism of pure reason. So our reason proves to be feeble, not powerful enough to solve these antinomies. So the antinomies are four. There are four of them. The first antinomy is this one. We cannot choose between two opposite theses. First thesis is that our universe is finite, both in space and in time. And another thesis is that our universe is infinite, both in space and in time. So when Kant tries to analyze the choice between these two opposite theses, he understands that we cannot choose either one or another alternative or one or another solution, because we cannot prove either the validity of that our universe is finite, or the validity of the thesis that our universe is infinite? Well, we should only uh, like be content with what uh, Descartes said, that our universe is indefinitely large. So Kant expressly used this Cartesian term indefinitum, or indefinite. So indefinite is something, a compromise between infinite and finite. But of course, this compromise does not solve the question. So because we want to know whether the universe, what indefinite is just like um, evading the question, but this is not enough. Okay, this is, well, the first antinomy. The second antinomy is whether the matter is divisible in infinity, or whether we are to stop at some atoms which are indivisible. Well, here we can see that Kant was not familiar with Boscovich hypothesis, and he doesn't mention this name. So perhaps Kant didn't read Boscovich book. Maybe he considered it to be unimportant. Because if we take Boscovich book, then we have how to say, some solution of this second antinomy, because the core of this antinomy is that if we regard atom as geometrical figure, or having some shape, then we can somehow even mentally continue to divide it. So we cannot understand what stops us from dividing it further. So what is there in his dimensions that does not allow us to continue this process of division? Okay. Well, but if, of course, if we take the idea of Boscovich that atoms are indivisible points, shapeless points, then of course the second antinomy will not take place. So this should be noted, that Kant didn't regard this important innovation of Boscovich. He didn't. So from this we can conclude that Boscovich remained unheard in his century. He was he was again, how to say, rediscovered, we can say. He was rediscovered by Faraday and Maxwell when they created their idea of electromagnetic field, and they needed some so philosophical foundation of their ideas. So that, well, this is also symptomatic that Kant didn't know about Boscovich, and it seems that because Kant was like following the literature, okay, so he was following the news of what happened in natural sciences, and himself wrote in his, when he was young, a book about the theory of the sky. So this is interesting that he didn't come across this work of Boscovich. So this is the second antinomy. So he couldn't also solve it. The third antinomy concerned the world of Spinoza, this problem of free will and necessity. So again, Kant understands that Spinoza, being a determinist, couldn't be sort of disproved by some rational argument, because the position of Spinoza is like defended, how to say, like cannot be broken, because it's very logically how to say, consistent, the position of Spinoza. Spinoza is well, builds his determinism on a set of definitions and theorems, and you cannot find a logical flaw in his system. That's why Einstein just took this system as the basis of his worldview. So Einstein was a good logician, you can imagine. So if there were some flaw, some mistake in say in reasonings of Spinoza, they would have been detected, but they weren't. So Spinoza gives a consistent deterministic concept of the world. But for Kant, the importance of free will lies in the sphere of ethics, of morality, because otherwise, if we negate free will, then we negate the sense of like conscience, the sense of guilt, the sense of duty, because the sense of duty can't stand if we regard our actions as necessarily um, coming out of us, sort of without any free decision. So we can speak about duty only in the context of free decision. But Kant understood that this free will, this our sense of duty, is something that also should be postulated or sort of, it is not, it cannot be proven, so, or proved, you see. So there are two positions, either the position of Spinoza or the position of Kant, and you have to choose, and you cannot find necessary arguments in favor of this or that position. So you can accept either the view of Spinoza, either the view of Kant. It's up to you, but it's not, somehow reason cannot give sufficient proofs of the validity of the truth of this or that position. So reason itself remains a sort of indecisive, or like he cannot choose here anything. Now the fourth antinomy is the antinomy between the idea of creation of this world out of nothing, or the idea of the first cause, or another idea of the infinite number of causes. So we can proceed in these causes in infinity. And when somebody will speak about God, we can ask this question: who created God? And so on. Okay. So this line of thought remained also valid. And for example, Lenin, in his polemics with Maxim Gorky, also when Gorky said perhaps their God exists, Lenin sharply sort of retorted, and who created God? And what did God do before creation of the world? Was he asleep? So Lenin was very sarcastic in his dispute with Maxim Gorky, who was like searching some idea of God, or playing with an idea of God. Okay. So you see that this argument against the existence of God remained throughout the history of subsequent philosophy. Well, Lenin is only one example. You can multiply these examples. But also another variant of like postulating the God as the source of all existence, as did Leibniz when he said, who could answer the question why there exists something rather than nothing? Okay, if you want to find the solution to this question, you can postulate God as the necessary reason for all existence. So also it's possible, rationally possible. So a reason itself that cannot choose between, say, the position of Leibniz and the position of Lenin, for example. So, well, of course, Lenin was not known to Kant, but the position, say, of some atheists like Goldbach or Denis Diderot, there were examples, or there were examples of atheists in the 18th century also. Well, so here is the foundation of Kant's criticism of pure reason. Well, Hegel, speaking about Kant's antinomies, he criticized Kant for that he never penetrated to the discovery of what the antinomies really and positively mean. And they meant, of course, with Hegel, the contradictions which are inherent to all the world. So these contradictions are not to be feared, but are to be accepted as the driving force of all evolution. But here we will speak about that later when we'll discuss Hegel, the theory of evolution, and many other subjects. The evolution of human knowledge with Auguste Comte, positivism. So it will all happen, I think, on Thursday. So because these topics are connected with the 19th century, not the 18th century. Well, we can say that Kant's philosophy was static. So also the philosophy of Spinoza and Descartes, you see, there is no development here. If we take Cartesian world, it's doesn't have the dimension of history or the dimension of time. So when you contemplate the immortality of your soul or the existence of God, there is no historical dimensions in your meditations. Okay, if you take Spinoza and his like pantheism, his world where everything is connected and where you cannot separate creator and creation, intelligence and body, there's also nothing from which could come development. Okay, so this is the weak point of Spinozism, that it has not this driving force. It cannot explain why something evolves, and Spinoza himself is no evolutionist. Okay, also the weak point of Spinoza, of course, is that his God is somehow fighting with itself when Turks attack Austrians, as was the joke of Pierre Bayle, that Spinoza's God is at fight with himself, because the Turks are also like parts of God and the Austrians parts of God. So when the war takes place, as say between Austrians and the Turks, so it seems that Spinoza's God is fighting with himself. Well, for Bayle, it was just a target for his humor or for his sarcasm, but for Hegel later it would be a starting point for quite new approach. So Hegel combined Spinozist worldview with his idea of contradictions and made it sort of living, made it developing and evolving, the Spinoza's like motionless world. Okay, the same with Leibniz, because for Leibniz the history is already sort of past in the mind of God. While God was choosing between possible worlds, they were sort of before his eyes with their past, present, and future. Okay, so when God chose the best possible world for us, this is already the consummation of history and of all development. Okay, we cannot find also the idea of motion with Voltaire, because he was always doubting, and of course he doubted whether the history has a goal. Okay, whether there is progress. Only one philosopher, French philosopher Condorcet, spoke about the idea of progress in the 18th century. So we can say that 18th century philosophy was more or less static, and only in the 19th century we have such new ideas as Darwinian evolutionism or Hegel's theory of progress, of development of the absolute spirit, and also we'll have Marxism and Marxist idea of how history takes place and what is the driving force of history and what is the end of history. Well, now 15 minutes are left just to speak about Kant's moral attitude and his moral standards. So maybe Marina, can you show us Karamzin, which was I think the last of our slides? Yes, Karamzin on Kant. Here we have a very interesting example of how Kant was regarded by intelligentsia of the 18th century. Well, we speak about Nikolai Karamzin, which is of course very much known to my Russian students, and the majority are Russians here. So I shouldn't introduce Karamzin to them, but because we have, say, Xavier from Venezuela, perhaps he's not so much acquainted with Nikolai Karamzin. Yes, Xavier, or am I mistaken?
No, we started it in high school actually, and also in my technical university. So it's
Okay,
very
okay. So
known,
you know
at least in
that,
South America.
yes,
Yes.
very good. Yes, thank you, Xavier. Javier. So you know that Karamzin is a famous Russian historian. He wrote History of Russia in many volumes. But we speak about Karamzin in his early years when he was only 25 years old, and he met Kant in the fateful year for Europe, the year 1789, the year of the French Revolution. Well, of course, at that time, nobody knew about the French Revolution because there were some, insurrections in Paris, and people didn't know to which end, how it all will end, okay? So it was only the start. So people were still quiet, especially in Russia and in Prussia, the countries most distant from France. So in this year, Nikolai Karamzin decided to travel into Europe. He was a wealthy man. He had his serfs. Okay, he was a landowner, so he could afford to have some extra money for travels. So he traveled to Europe, and his route led him from St. Petersburg to East Prussia, to Königsberg, which was the first big state of Prussia, which he met on his route. Okay, and while being in Königsberg, he thought that it would be he would be very he would feel sorry if he wouldn't meet Immanuel Kant, who was a celebrity, the most important citizen of Königsberg. But he was afraid that Kant, who was at that time 65, and rather an old man, he would not be accessible, you see, because people after 60s, as I can observe on myself, are less prone to establishing new contacts. Well, maybe I am an exception. I very much appreciate my new contacts here with you, but still there is some opposition because people get emotionally like sort of worn out, okay, emotionally worn out because of this difficult life. You see, it creates a lot of disillusions, and so I can understand Voltaire with all his disillusions and his doubts when which he expressed in his letter to Friedrich II. Also, I can understand that perhaps Kant would be of the same disposition, but not so, because Kant was at that time still full of energy, and when Karamzin dared to ask for an audience, Kant accepted it benevolently. And so they had a talk. You can see here, Karamzin described it in the diary of his journals. Yesterday after dinner, I visited the illustrious Kant, the wise and profound metaphysician. Okay, and you see, he addressed him with these words: I am a Russian nobleman. I admire your great man and wish to present my compliments to Kant. Well, and Kant immediately invited him to sit down. Uh, and then they discussed different subjects. But if you continue reading this book, you would see that eventually all ended with the subject that Kant most cherished, cherished subject for Kant, the subject of morality, what is good and what is bad. This morality was the theme that was always uh, the center of interest for Kant. Kant's idea was that philosophy can help man to become moral, because philosophy shows man what is right and what is wrong, and helps him to develop the strategies of good behavior and to become good. And so there's a kind of moral obligation for all men to be good to each other. And this moral obligation is, we have this force to sort of, how to say, to implement this, to answer this obligation, to fulfill this obligation. And this force is our free will, which is given to us by God. So God gives us free will. This free will couldn't be given to us by inanimate nature, because nature is enslaved by determinism. So this gift of free will can only come from above. And so perhaps it will be remunerated. And so Kant told Karamzin, so you are a young man, I am an old man. So I want to tell you, be, so to say, be good, try to behave in a proper way to fulfill your duty. And then when you will reach the old age, like me, you will fearlessly, how to say, look at death, and this prospect of death will not frighten you, because you know that you have a clear conscience and that nothing can trouble you when you live this life. And perhaps you even can cherish the maybe weak hope for some remuneration for your like for your life if you spend it properly. Okay, well, this is sounds a little bit too pathetic, but that was the idea of Kant. Kant, had a not enough sense of humor. He was almost always serious, and a little bit pathetical. Yes, that can be said about Kant. And of course, the like this meeting with young gentlemen from Russia, for whom Kant wanted to just take the role of a mentor or of a teacher of life. So Kant eagerly took this role of a teacher or of a kind of a tutor or coach for this young nobleman from Russia, and to teach him how to live. Okay, well, I don't know how much Karamzin implemented these maxims of Kant and how was it possible for a man who exploits the labor of serfs to be impeccable or morally correct, because I found one essay, I think by Mark, I forgot the surname, but it seems to me that the name of the student is Mark, and perhaps he's listening to me also. And that he wrote that how can we speak about morality or ethics in a society where slavery is just the foundation of economic order, okay? So slavery is highly unjust and immoral, and so we cannot speak of justice and morality as long as slavery continues to exist. So of course, the same reproach could be addressed to Kant or even to Pushkin, to all those Russian noblemen who sort of exploited the work of their serfs, okay, and didn't let them be freed. Okay, this is another problem, but well, maybe somehow they could reach this their internal peace. I mean, Pushkin and Karamzin, who were, you know, acquainted with each other. Well, and I think that Kant also did not start the talk with the question of serfdom and slavery. Well, he understood that the spiritual progress or ethical progress should be done not just by violence, but by certain stages. So the first thing to do is to uh, be gentleman, be intelligent, be have a sense of pity and a sense of obligation. So these are the first things that are to be implemented. Then will follow maybe more perfect things. So this is, well, the essence of this talk of Nikolai Karamzin with Kant. And so we can see that Kant, sort of this idea of Kant was how to perfect the behavior of man. But the idea of development, or this was absent with Kant, and only just we can find it with Hegel. So this idea of the evolution of the world spirit. Of this we'll speak, I think, on Thursday. So also 2 minutes are left, and I remind you that the deadline for your second essay expires on Thursday evening. Yes, Marina, am I right?
I think so.
Yes, so 26 is the deadline. Okay, so today is 24th. So I just ask you, implement this idea of Kant, the idea of duty and obligation, and remember what Kant said: you should, therefore you can. Okay, or you ought, therefore you can. This is the saying attributed to Kant. Okay, your obligation gives you supervision. Was not related to university yet. Um, what means the supervision? Uh, well, please write me privately, Alexandra, because I don't understand your question. What do you mean by supervision? Uh, Supervision of Kant, his vision of the aim of life, I don't know. Well, sometimes it's difficult to establish contact through Zoom. It's maybe easier to talk face to face, but this is not allowed to us now. So we have to find other ways of communicating. So I thank everybody for listening to me. thank you for your patience, because I had today enormous difficulty of finding good English words, right words for expressing my thoughts. Possibly on Thursday I will be more talkative. Yes, and so we'll start with Hegel, okay? And we have also Marx, Nietzsche, Auguste Comte, and other very important, and Charles Darwin, and other very important uh, mm, figures. And okay, so thank you, and I wish you a good day. Thank you, Marina, for helping me enormously today, because without your help, I would be still less eloquent than I was. Um, and I very much appreciate your help, and I hope you will also help me the day after tomorrow.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. And I wish you good studies and continuing your project, because of course you are not a philosopher. This is your volunteer work, but your main work is as chemist. So I wish you good insights in your work on chemistry and perhaps new discoveries.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Goodbye. Goodbye.